I'd want to thank Professor Snead for hanging in there. Carter, are you there? First of all? Okay. So Professor Carter Snead is going to give our first presentation tonight. Professor of Law, Notre Dame Law School. This session is called The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. Professor Carter Snead is one of the world's leading experts on public bioethics, the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. His research explores issues relating to neuroethics, enhancement, human embryo research, assisted reproduction, abortion, and end-of-life decision-making. He is the author of What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, a Harvard University Press publication from 2020. Wall Street Journal called it 10 of the best books of 2020. Tonight we're going to hear about the foundational role of the body in public bioethics and the challenge created by expressive individualism. Welcome, Professor Snead. Do we have you?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We're speaking to you in Indiana. Is that correct?
I'm in Indiana, South Bend, Indiana, as the crow flies, not terribly far from Toronto, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you in person this evening, but I'm very grateful to participate remotely.
All right. Well, we'll let you take it away, and thank you very much for joining us. We'll touch base with you at the end of your presentation for some question and answer.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank the organizers of this event. I would like to thank Dan and Ryan and Nicole, especially Nicole. Nicole is an unbelievably talented administrator, and she was so patient with me and so helpful to me in making this possible, and I'll be very grateful to all of you. Your organization is so essential. Physicians have such enormous social capital, well-earned and deserved social capital, intellectual capital, spiritual capital even, to be advocates for the intrinsic equal dignity of every human being, born and unborn, from conception to natural death. And I just want to thank you all for your witness and your advocacy and your hard work, and especially for those of you who live in parts of Canada where it's very difficult and may feel lonely, and you may feel that the powers of the state or of elite culture are arrayed against you. I just want to thank you all very much for your continued efforts in that struggle. And as I say, it's my honor to participate with you this evening and contribute in some small way to this amazing organization, which is indispensable, bringing you all together and mobilizing for to build a culture of life in Canada. So my talk this evening does draw upon the themes of the book, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. And it is a book that focuses in part, and one of the framing examples that I'll be using this evening, does in fact draw from American law and public policy, and in fact, and I'm going to be focusing on assisted reproductive technology a little bit in my comments. And I know from my time working at the President's Council on Bioethics, where I had the privilege of representing the United States in negotiations with other member states, including Canada, and we had Canadian experts come to our council in Washington, D.C. to make presentations, and the legal landscape in Canada is, as I understand it, quite different from the United States in the field of assisted reproduction. You have a pretty robust statutory scheme and regulatory scheme that we don't have in the United States, and so perhaps some of the problems that I'll be outlining this evening are not so much problems in your country as a legal matter, although I suspect, based on my understanding of your culture, that the issue of expressive individualism and the way it maps onto the law, I think, might be similarly problematic in Canada as it is in the United States. But in any event, we can have a conversation after the conclusion of my prepared remarks and sort of compare and contrast our respective experiences. But the bulk of my comments are going to be, as I say, drawn from the book. I'm going to share my screen now so you all can see my screen. And the framing of the talk follows largely the framing of the book. I'll be making two arguments this evening, two claims, one of which is a methodological claim. It's a kind of argument about how best to understand the legal landscape or the policy landscape relating to public bioethics, and this would be applicable in Canada or the United States or anywhere in the world. And the argument here is that the richest and most potent method of analyzing matters of public bioethics is through what I describe as an inductive anthropological inquiry. And it may sound highly technical or highfalutin, but that expression, that phrase, inductive anthropological inquiry, is pretty straightforward and easily explained. The inquiry is inductive in the sense that you take the law as you find it, right? You don't bring any sort of preconception to your initial encounter with the law or policy landscape. You say, I'm just going to take the law as I find it, whether it be a Canadian law, whether it be American law, whatever particular source of law or authority you're analyzing. And it's an anthropological inquiry in the sense that you are asking fundamentally one question. What is the vision of human identity and human flourishing that anchors and animates the law and policy in this particular area? What does the law assume you and I, or who does the law assume you and I are, and what we owe to one another, and what our needs are, and what the threats to us are? The law has to have an operating set of assumptions about who we are and what constitutes our flourishing if the law is to be intelligible. And I'll explain that more momentarily. And that's especially true in the context of public bioethics, which is the regulation of law, science, medicine, biotechnology, and the biosciences in the name of ethical goods. It's the regulation of the practice of medicine, for example, or the development of biotechnologies, or the application of biotechnologies in the name of some ethical good. That area of law inextricably rests upon a vision of the person and human flourishing. And when I took that question or that method and analyzed what I describe as the three vital conflicts of public bioethics: the law and policy relating to abortion, the law and policy connected to assisted reproductive technologies, and the laws concerning end-of-life decision-making, including assisted suicide. What I found was, what came to the surface was a kind of dominant anthropological set of premises that very closely resemble what have been described by Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor and sociologist Robert Bellah as expressive individualism. It's a vision. I'll explain what that means momentarily. Even though the term may be unfamiliar, the description of what of the human account, the narrative of what a human being that goes with it, I think will be immediately recognizable to you. And expressive individualism as a dominant anthropological premise that underlies laws and policies connecting to these vital conflicts of public bioethics is unsuitable, because it doesn't actually capture the full lived reality of human life. In particular, it doesn't capture our embodied reality. That is, that we don't merely have, but we are bodies, that we are a dynamic, integrated unity of mind and body, rather than simply a mind that occupies an instrumental body. It's a vision that can't and doesn't make sense of this lived reality of human embodiment and what goes with it, which includes our vulnerability, our reciprocal dependence upon one another, and our natural limits. And because it can't make sense of our embodiment, it's not a suitable foundation for public bioethics. And so the laws and policies in the space go badly wrong insofar as they rest upon this false anthropology. And then in my talk, to make this a little bit clearer, I'll say a couple more words about what I mean by public bioethics. I will explain a little bit further what I mean by an anthropological analysis of law and policy. I'll talk about expressive individualism and why it is an incomplete and indeed dangerous conception of the self that is forgetful of the body, to borrow a phrase from one of my colleagues at Notre Dame, Alistair McIntyre. And then I'll pivot and make some brief suggestions about how we might mount an anthropological corrective to correct our mistaken premises, our incomplete premises at the core of law and policy, and remember the body, to try to reintegrate the conception of our embodied lives into laws and policies, as well as talk a little bit about the goods and practices and virtues that are necessary for our shared embodied lives to protect us and to ensure our flourishing. And then we'll see how much time's left, but to make this more concrete, I'm going to talk about the law of assisted reproductive technology in the United States, perhaps as a cautionary tale for those of you in Canada, about how the law can go badly wrong when it rests upon a false vision of human identity and flourishing. Okay, so what do I mean by public bioethics? First of all, as I've said a couple times now, but I'll say again just for the sake of clarity, public bioethics is about governance. It's not simply a field of intellectual inquiry. It's not debating and reading and thinking about bioethics. It is the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. So it is the business of the political branches of government. It's the business of courts. It's the business of administrative agencies. It's the business, in some ways, of intergovernmental agencies to craft regulatory legal authorities that are designed for the sake of responding to the human contexts in which these ethical questions arising from biomedical science and biotechnology come up. Okay, so, and it's fundamentally concerned with human vulnerability and dependence and frailty and finitude. The issues in public bioethics relate to the governance of the human context, including procreation, pregnancy and babies, and wasting illnesses and devastating injuries, and desperate enrollees in clinical trials, fearful patients, the disabled, the elderly, the dying, and the dead. Put another way, public bioethics is most deeply about the meaning and consequences of human embodiment. The fact that we experience ourselves, one another, and the world around us in, and more precisely and accurately, as living and dying bodies. And the issues in public bioethics since its inception in the late 1960s, early 1970s, at least in the United States, originally grew out of several questions connected to protections for human subjects of biomedical research. You are all probably familiar with the article from 1966 by anesthesiologist, Harvard anesthesiologist Henry Beecher, detailing in the New England Journal of Medicine, detailing 22 clinical instances of clinical research involving really shameful examples of exploitation and abuse, even of vulnerable human subjects. In almost every case, there was no mention of informed consent. All but 2 cases, there was no mention. In no case was there any therapeutic benefit possible for the subjects. And in many instances, really all the instances, there were shocking ethical breaches, including the deliberate injection of intellectually disabled children with hepatitis, including the injection of live cancer cells in elderly patients suffering from dementia, and on and on and on. That was the crucible in which American public bioethics, the legal and political and policy responses to those scandals, gave rise to American public bioethics. And since then, the issues have been extremely broad. On your screen, you see only a handful of the issues that relate to American public bioethics or Canadian public bioethics, issues involving embryo and fetal research, assisted reproduction, human cloning, abortion, genetic screening, gene editing, access to healthcare, defining death, property in the body, research involving human-animal hybrids or chimeras, conscience protections, all kinds of questions, right? The 3 issues that I take up in the book that I've already mentioned relate to ART, abortion, and end-of-life decision-making. So, to the methodological claim, you might be asking, what the heck does anthropology, understood in its sort of original sense, not in its modern academic sense, but its original sense of what it means to be and flourish as a human being, what does that have to do with law and politics and public policy? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Law itself is about and for the protection and flourishing of persons. That's what law is for. That's the end and purpose of law. Law is about protecting persons. It's about promoting the flourishing of persons. And as such, it unavoidably rests upon usually undeclared conceptions of what a human person is. But just to be clear, this is not the same question as when life begins, which we all know begins at the moment of sperm egg fusion. The conception of the human being gives rise to a new, independent, self-directing, living human organism. That's not the same question as what a person is and what constitutes human flourishing, but it is obviously deeply connected to it. The law has to make assumptions about what human beings are, what persons are, what their flourishing is, what threats there might be. And as a result, to understand law most richly and deeply, you need to unpack and uncover what the anchoring vision of human identity and flourishing is. Who and what does the law assume a person to be? And then you can ask the question of whether or not the law is built on a true or false understanding of human person and human identity. Now, somebody might say, well, don't people disagree strongly about human identity, human nature? Don't some people even deny the reality of human nature? Well, of course they do. But there's no avoiding, even though there is a pluralism of views on these matters, and these are deeply subjects of deep disagreement, there's no avoiding making an operational assumption about what and who a person is. The law can't be neutral on that proposition, because what the law is supposed to do is promote flourishing and protect persons. And if you don't have an operating assumption about what and who a person is, you don't even know where to start. And the law, at best, would be arbitrary and capricious. So when you turn that lens of an inductive anthropological analysis on these vital conflicts, what comes to the surface is, at least in the American culture, and I suspect also in Canadian culture, and I followed your debate over assisted suicide and the judicial decisions that emerged from that, and it did seem to me to be shot through with premises of human personhood relating to expressive individualism. We can talk about that in the question period if you want. It's certainly true in my country. Expressive individualism is a false foundation for public bioethics. It is an incomplete vision of who and what persons are. And what expressive individualism holds is that a person is an isolated, unencumbered, to use Charles Taylor's word, atomized individual self. The fundamental personal reality is the individual self, shorn and abstracted from any kind of constitutive attachment, any kind of narrative, any kind of idea about connections to family or lineage or community or religion or even civilization. The idea is the fundamental reality is the atomized individual self. And that self is defined not as a dynamic integrated union of body and mind. The self is defined exclusively and solely by the will, by the mind. It's a purely cognitive account of what a person is. The body is instrumental. To use a philosophical term, it is a dualistic account of what a person is, marking a radical distinction between the mind, which is you, from the body, which is a thing that you can use and harness to pursue your flourishing. Persons are defined as individual choosers and consumers, and human flourishing is framed as the pursuit of projects of one's own construction. There's an imperative to live your originality. You are, to use Michael Sandel's phrase, a self-originating source of valid claims. What human flourishing is, through the lens of expressive individualism, is understood as interrogating the depths of the self, to listen to the inner voice which is not connected to any relationship or narrative or tradition. It's an inner voice that is morally definitive. It is your authentic individual subjective truth. It is the only thing that binds you. You find your interior truth, you express it, and then you configure your life through the exercise of your will and the instrumentality of your body and everything else to pursue the project, your own original authentic project of the will. That's what flourishing is within this framework. And it is profoundly, to use another philosophical phrase, anti-teleological, meaning it holds the view that there's nothing to be learned about the purposes of things by observing their external appearances or external givens. I don't know what a tree is for by looking at a tree, its structure and function. I don't know what I am for or what I'm to do. There's no evidence within the study of the structure and function of my body or my psyche or anything like that. That can't tell me anything about who I am or what I'm supposed to do. I'm a blank slate. I'm a blank slate that can invent myself through the interrogation of my own will or my own interior sentiments, and then to use my will to express that interior authentic truth and to configure my life plan accordingly. And in this framework, there are no unchosen obligations. There is no one who has a claim on me that binds me to do something unless I decide that it is consistent with my own interior authentic truth. I don't have obligations to my children. I don't have obligations to my elderly parents. I don't have obligations to my neighbor or to my community unless I judge those obligations to be consistent with my own interior life plan and formulate those obligations and memorialize those obligations through a process of consent. And thus personal relationships are really viewed through an instrumental and transactional framework. And that includes relationships to family and friends. Persons, in fact, while they can come together and collaborate in the service of a mutually agreed upon goal, but they also maybe even more frequently encounter one another as adversaries. They're isolated adversaries, isolated atomized wills who encounter each other and have to overbear one another to pursue their own flourishing. And if you want to look to what ethics looks like under the anthropology of expressive individualism, it probably won't surprise you to learn that autonomy, the good of autonomy and self-determination, rises to the very apex of the hierarchy of goods to which all other goods are subordinated. That is the primary good within this anthropological framework. It's autonomy and self-determination. And justice and injustice are reframed as the constraint on my freedom, my radical freedom to pursue projects of my own choosing. And the role of government, and here's where law comes in, the role of government in this framework is to remove constraints, public constraints, private constraints, perhaps even natural constraints, and otherwise provide the conditions for the assertion of the unencumbered individual self. Now, this is in some ways a very an attractive kind of vision, right? It looks like the idea of the atom, especially to Americans, maybe less so to people who are more communitarian, but to sort of Americans who are kind of individualistic in our bones, this can kind of seem sexy, right? Like the idea of the atomized will bestriding the environment, harnessing and bending things and relationships and people and my own body to pursue my own authentic interior truth. That sounds like a pretty romantic vision in a certain way. And in fact, it's not, and I use that word intentionally because in part, the romantic poets, Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth, and others were strong devotees of something like expressivism, which became more commonplace in the middle of the 20th century. But the problem with expressive individualism is it's false. It captures something true about us. We are free. We are independent. We are individuated, and there can be value in consulting the interior depths of one's own imagination and sentiment to come up with interesting and maybe even transgressive ideas if there are ideas to overbear problematic traditions, if there are problematic traditions or strictures. That can be valuable, right? But that is a very small piece of what it means to be a human being. And in fact, if you as physicians understand this better than anyone, as the arc of human life progresses, we begin our life in complete and utter dependence upon other people as babies. Before we're babies, as unborn children, newborn children, we're utterly dependent upon the beneficence of others for our very survival. And in the best case scenario, we begin a kind of gentle arc from dependence to independence, and we hit our apex at the height of our powers. And some very privileged people would be able to kind of bend the world around them to their will and configure their life according to their own interior authentic truth. But even those people, that very small segment of the population, this is a one moment snapshot on the arc of life as humanly lived, because immediately you begin to decline into total dependence once again. And some people, as you all know, as physicians better than anyone, live their entire lives in total dependence on other people. Many of us have massive disruptions throughout our arc of life in which we become totally dependent on others because of injury or illness or what have you. Obviously, in the global pandemic, we've seen our vulnerability presented to us in a very strict and very stark way. So expressive individualism is simply false as a narrative account of what it means to be as a human being. It ignores and can't even make sense of our mutual dependence. It can't make sense of our vulnerability. It can't make sense of our natural limits. As Alistair McIntyre, my colleague again at the University of Notre Dame, De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, has said, all human beings exist on a scale of disability. And what people need, what embodied beings need for their survival and flourishing is not unfettered freedom to impose our will on ourselves, our nature, and the natural world and others around us. What we need to survive and flourish are what McIntyre calls networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. Uncalculated giving and graceful receiving networks composed of people who are willing to make the good of another person their own good without seeking anything in return. That's what embodied beings, because we live as fragile, corruptible, weak bodies in time. We are vulnerable, and we need each other, and we need to take care of each. We need people to take care of us, and without people to take care of us, who are taking care of us not because it fulfills their some interior subjective life plan, but because they're actually genuinely making our good their good. The good is outside of them. It's our good making our good their good. That's how we survive. Every single person who can hear my voice right now is here because someone, probably your parents, made your good their good without seeking anything in return. As all of us parents know, there are pretty long stretches in which a completely dependent baby gives no reciprocal affection, gives no reciprocal, and you're not getting a lot out of the baby when you're getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning the newborn to care for them and to keep them warm and fed and sheltered and clean and healthy. There's a genuine outpouring of self in that situation. That's what we depend on. But I argue that it's not simply for our survival that we depend on these networks, but these networks actually teach us, and this is a normative claim on my part, what it is that we're supposed to be. We're supposed to become the kind of people who can make the good of someone else our own good without seeking anything in return. That's what it means to be fully human, in my argument. We're at our most human when we're taking care of other people. And so these networks, first of all, keep us alive, but then they teach us, and we move from in the best case scenario, we move from a kind of a receiver of unconditional care and support and protection to an uncalculated giver of those things for the next person in the network who requires our help. And so, to put it in a very succinct way, I would say that by virtue of our embodiment, human beings are made for love and friendship. And this is something that expressive individualism misses entirely. It's unable to recognize the unchosen claims of the weak, including children, our own children or other children, the disabled and the elderly. It leads to loneliness and dislocation and alienation because there are no constitutive relationships. There's no definitive relationship or narrative into which we understand ourselves as ourselves. It's death haunted because it makes the self the sole point of the entire universe. That means the death of the self is the extinction of the universe, which Alexander Solzhenitsyn reminds us is terrifying. And then, of course, as Bella showed in his social science research, and as others have worried about, this expressive individualism leads to the erosion of social and familial ties. It leads to the erosion of these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. So, how do we fix this problem? How do we integrate goods and practices and virtues into our laws and policies that allow us to remember the body, right? To promote the flourishing and safety of embodied beings. Well, first of all, as I've said, we need to recognize that these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving are the essential structures that we have to shore up. And we have to become the kind of person who can make the good of others our own good. And we need to learn to see the vulnerable other through the practice of memory and moral imagination. And we have to practice what McIntyre calls, although I've added a couple to his list, the virtues of acknowledged dependence. The virtues of uncalculated giving are the virtues that are necessary to contribute to these networks upon which we all depend. First of which is just generosity, giving to others in proportion to their need. The other is hospitality, welcoming the stranger because he or she is a stranger, not because we hope to get something from them in advance or in return. And then thirdly, and this is essential for doctors, of course, misericordia, which is a virtue of taking on the suffering of another as your own suffering, to seek to heal, to seek to comfort the other, because you regard their suffering as your suffering. And if that's not possible, merely to accompany them in their suffering. And then on the other side, we have the virtues of graceful receiving. Chief among them is the virtue of gratitude. That is to think about and reflect upon the fact that we are here solely because of the beneficence of others. We didn't invent ourselves. We didn't create ourselves. We are here because others took care of us. And that should lead us to feel grateful. And that gratitude should engender humility and to kind of understand that everything is a gift and that sometimes gifts are distributed in unequal ways. And if I am unequally benefited by gifts, I should look around and see who is around me that I can extend my care to who are less fortunate than I am. It leads you to be open to the unbidden. It leads you to avoid an attitude of rational mastery and control and extraction and to tolerate imperfection. And that becomes especially important in the context of medicine and caring for people who are imperfect, especially the disabled, imperfect in body, not in ultimate value, of course. It should engender a sense of solidarity. We're all connected to one another in the sense of our shared embodiment, mutual dependence, and reciprocal indebtedness. It should lead us all to respect the intrinsic equal dignity of every human being, born and unborn. It should lead us to be truthful with ourselves and others. But all of these virtues of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, I think, can be understood through the lens of authentic human friendship, making the good of another your own. And practices that take you outside of yourself, that draw your gaze up from the interior to the exterior, to look and see who you can help, who needs our help, who can we render aid to, are the practices that lead to the deepening of these virtues. And the paradigm, the sort of network of uncalculated giving par excellence, again, as I've come back to several times now, is the relationship of parenthood, the relationship of parent and child. Parent does not care for his or her children because it fulfills a life plan or because you have a contract to do it. It's intrinsic to the relationship. It is an unchosen obligation that we have to take care of our children. And children, conversely, don't need to earn the right or privilege to be cared for by their parents, right? They are entitled to be cared for by virtue of their role in that relational context. And then obviously not everybody's a parent. And so I'm just taking that as an important example. Participation in the voluntary associations, what Bella calls communities of memory that have goods outside the narrow self-interest of the members, is another useful context in which we can practice these virtues. So let's make it a little bit more concrete. Okay, it may seem a little abstract as I've been discussing it thus far. Let's make it concrete. Let me share with you very briefly what I learned when I analyzed the field, the law and policy relating to assisted reproductive technology in the United States through the lens of an anthropological inductive analysis. Okay, I asked, what's the vision of the human person and flourishing that anchors American law and policy concerning assisted reproduction? Now, a few things about our own legal tradition here in the United States and the practice of medicine is that the practice of medicine generally, and for very good reasons, are mostly regulated at the front end of the process. That is, physicians are licensed and certified, but once they're licensed and certified by the state, they have a wide range of motion to be dynamic in practicing their art of medicine, so long as they stay within the boundaries of what we call the standard of care, which is defined in various ways, but instantiated in the private law of torts in the United States. That is through the medical malpractice litigation. That is the fundamental mechanism of ongoing day-to-day regulation of the practice of medicine once those individuals are licensed and certified. Now, there are, of course, also disciplinary boards, and there are hospital privileges, and there are other kind of mechanisms of ancillary regulation. But once you're licensed and certified, you have broad latitude to practice medicine, and that's good because doctors need that latitude to practice their art and use their creativity and their knowledge and their wisdom in service of the art of medicine. But as a legal framework governing a practice, that a medical context in which it's not a cure of a dysfunction, but rather the creation of a new human being for the sake, in the context of ART, reproductive technologies, that's a different thing. And yet it's still governed in the same way in my country through the lens of the practice of medicine. There are some very loose and inefficacious statutory standards that have been passed into law, but for reasons that we don't need to dwell on, we can talk about, they basically have no meaningful impact on the regulation of assisted reproductive technologies. It's basically, and probably unlike Canada, it's pretty wide open. Some have compared it to the Wild West, where you can effectively use almost any means, whether as long as it's in the standard of care, to make a baby, to become pregnant and have a baby. And so you might ask, well, what's the anthropological assumptions that would underlie a kind of completely wide open and effectively unregulated field of assisted reproductive technology? Well, for that, you can look to the writings and commentary of certain practitioners and certain very important architects. John Robertson was an eminent law professor at the University of Texas who was very much engaged in public bioethics, was on most of the advisory boards, major federal and local advisory boards relating to public bioethics, really throughout his entire career. But most importantly, for these purposes, present purposes, he was the former chair of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, which is the principal professional society for assisted reproduction for physicians and other practitioners in this field. And they're also the principal lobbying agency and the most powerful voice in the creation or not, as the case may be, of laws and policies in this particular area. And John Robertson promulgated ethics opinions and worked very closely with the leadership of ASRM, which advocated very successfully its point of view around the country, both at the federal level and at the various state levels. And John Robertson, in a book in 1994 called Children of Choice, wrote, he was very direct about what he thought procreation was for and why he thought it should be effectively unregulated, assisted reproduction. He said the choice to pursue or avoid procreation is essential to self-definition, pursuit of desires, and self-expression. That is why there is a nearly insuperable right to procreate or not procreate through coital means or non-coital means. He makes the argument throughout the course of this book. But you can see in that very account the core of expressive individualism, what procreation is for. And it's not even procreation, it's the choice to pursue or avoid procreation is essential because it's essential to self-definition, pursuit of desires, and self-expression. Now, when I was the general counsel of the President's Council on Bioethics, we invited Dr. Jerry Shatton from the University of Pittsburgh, a very eminent practitioner of reproductive medicine and also a very successful bench scientist. We asked him to come talk about assisted reproduction, especially as augmented by genomic knowledge and various genetic screening techniques. And we asked him just very directly, what is the purpose? What's the point of genetic screening and assisted reproduction? And he had 6 weeks to think about it. And he came back with the following articulation. He said, the goal of genetic screening and assisted reproduction is to, quote, to help parents realize their dream of a disease-free legacy. Now, something that's missing from these statements, I think will immediately occur to you. What's missing from both of these statements is the notion of a child. Now, the word parent is used in Shatton's quote, but the object of the parent's desires are not the child, but rather a disease-free legacy. And the object of the desire of the individual that is sort of implicit in Robertson's statement is self-definition, pursuit of desires, and self-expression. It's not about becoming a parent. It's about realizing your dreams. It's about self-definition. It's about self-expression. That's the vision of these two very influential individuals, including Robertson, whose organization essentially was the architect of the American legal landscape, such as it is, which is defined, as I said, by the absence of law more than the presence of law and regulation. And so the consequences of this landscape, animated by that particular view of personhood, are quite stark. We have, I think, a lot more than you all do in your country, a huge instance of multiple gestations and births, which cause very significant complications, both for babies and moms. We have 1 million living embryonic human beings in cryostorage in the United States. We have widespread practice of the adjuncts of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And that is very commonly used in almost every IVF clinic in America for purposes of sex selection. It's not merely used for the sake of identifying embryonic human beings who have either a disease or a chromosomal abnormality or a propensity, a higher probability of contracting a late onset disease. It's done to find out what the sex of the embryonic human being is and to screen for those preferred sexes and to discard and destroy human embryos that are of a disfavored sex. And I wouldn't have to, you probably can imagine which sex is preferred and which is not, and the kind of discriminatory narrative that goes along with that. But that sort of selection is not limited to sex selection. It also includes trait selection. There are organizations, there are big businesses in the United States that advertise. Now, whether they can do it or not is a separate matter, but they advertise to using different genomic interventions to identify certain babies that have light skin color, or particular hair color, or particular eye color. Or there are some that use different kinds of data analytics and genetic screening to try to identify those embryonic human beings that will have low IQ. And they claim in the near future to be able to do the same thing for high IQ. Obviously, human cloning, as far as we know, there's never been a live-born child that was the product of somatic cell nuclear transfer, but there are no limits on it in the United States outside of those handful of states that ban it. There's no federal limit on human cloning in the United States. There are markets for gametes, the buying and selling of egg and sperm, and it's especially dramatic for ova. There are advertisements all over the place, especially at colleges and universities, for young women with high test scores and good health records and who are athletic and of a certain height and of a certain appearance. Some of them can be paid up to $50,000 for their ova. There has been a shift in the direction of consumerism and commodification, even of the gestational process itself. And you have surrogacy in the United States, where women are paid to carry other people's babies. And in this, this becomes especially worrisome when we think about targeting poor and vulnerable populations who may choose to be surrogates, not out of their own full volition, but rather because they feel compelled to by circumstance. But even those who become pregnant can be subject to enormous pressures that look a lot like quality assurance and quality control. The images you see right now on the screen are a couple from, I'm not sure if they're from Australia or New Zealand, but they contracted with the woman that you see in this image, this poor woman, to carry a baby. They paid her. And then they found out that the baby she was carrying had Down syndrome. You see the baby right there. And they demanded that she get an abortion. And they, thankfully, she refused, and there was no way to compel her to get an abortion, thankfully. But she felt enormous pressure, and it wouldn't have been surprising had she gotten an abortion, because she felt so pressured financially and the possibility of a lawsuit. But she rejected their demands and gave birth to this beautiful child and is raising that child on her own. But this whole scenario illustrates the kind of commodification of the body and consumerism that follows from basically a lawless space, as we have in the United States, essentially, for assisted reproduction. So if you take a step back and you ask, okay, what are persons in this landscape? How do we think about this? You realize very quickly that the assumptions of the law, now let me be clear, I'm talking about the law's assumptions about people, not the actual people themselves, not even the self-understanding of the people involved in these clinical contexts. But the law assumes that persons are conceived as individuals pursuing an identity-defining plan. The goods at stake are framed in terms of individualism, privacy, choice, rational mastery, bargain for exchange. The law instantiates these goods because the law assumes that's what people want and what they need. And what's missing is any consideration of embodiment involving procreation, the reality of vulnerability and dependence and finitude and the relationship among the generations, or reciprocal indebtedness, unchosen obligations to vulnerable others, tolerance of disability or imperfection, openness to the unbidden. Even really the concepts of children, parents, and family are missing from these assumptions. Children and family are viewed by the law, not by the people themselves, but by the law through the lens of will, a project freely chosen and constructed or rejected for our own goals, sometimes with the aid of technology. The parents dream of a disease-free legacy. There are in this space no unchosen obligations. Now, let me be very, very clear. I am not saying that patients and people that seek fertility care and assisted reproduction understand themselves through the lens of expressive individualism. Quite the opposite. What I'm saying is the law assumes that people are atomized individual will seeking to carve their own destiny and realize their own self-expression. That's what the law assumes. And because of those assumptions, the legal landscape is configured as it is, with no restraints, no protections from vulnerable patients against unscrupulous practitioners of IVF, no protections from our own internal temptations when we feel vulnerable and sad and depressed and probably broke because you feel that the only thing that you want to be is a parent and your body has betrayed you, right? The law assumes an atomized will seeking to assert its unencumbered self. But the reality is these patients, what they want is to be a parent, which is to be embedded in a relationship of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. They want to be parents. They want to be the parent of a child that they welcome and love unconditionally. That's what they want. But the law isn't constructed to protect those wants. The law isn't protected to advance those goods. The law is configured in a way based on a false image of who these people are and what they want. If a person goes to an IVF doctor, they're not going to assert their unencumbered self. They're not going to realize their dream of a disease-free legacy, any more so than when anybody's sick and they go to a doctor that they're trying to impose their unencumbered self on the universe. They want help. Their body is failing them in some way, and they want someone like you all who will care for them using all of your skills and all of your creativity and all of your humanity and compassion and all your training to care for them. That's what they want. And that's what people who are seeking fertility treatment want as well. But the law can't see that. And what it does instead is it in the United States at least, provides an unfettered, wide open field to pursue your dreams and to assert your will. And that's not what people need or want. And therefore, patients themselves, are unprotected. Children are unprotected. Now, how can we fix this? We begin with an anthropological corrective. We think about what it means to be a parent. And then we measure our legal framework against the goods that we identify from thinking clearly in the first instance about what it means to be a parent. And Leon Kass, my former boss and mentor, used to say it, so this very beautiful thing. He said, a child is a gift. A child is a mysterious stranger that you welcome and love unconditionally. Okay? And so we should ask ourselves what forms of procreation that the law facilitates and encourages, and what form of procreation aligns with the notion of a child as a gift. Making procreation versus making babies. It's a gift versus a project. Versus what forms of reproduction reflect the imposition of rational mastery, control, and technology to produce a desired outcome. It's a paradigm of gift versus a paradigm of project. This is what our goal should be. This is how we should think about what we are. We should think about the paradigm of parenthood. It's procreation, not baby making. It's equal dignity, not exploitation. It's healing and not enhancement. It's embodiment, not mere will. It's humility and not hubris. It's solidarity. It's not radical individualism. It's family, not partnership in a mere project. It's love and openness, not force and control. And we can measure the success or failure of our laws and policies and practices by keeping this ideal in mind about what we're trying to do when we care for people who are suffering from infertility. We mean to care for them in a way that at every step of the process, every single step, every single person should be measured according to the good of creating, of procreation, of conceiving, gestating, and giving birth to, delivering, and then rearing a child who is welcome and loved unconditionally. And those practices and those policies that are antithetical to that goal, we should reconstruct our legal landscape to deter and avoid those kinds of practices. Those that favor that outcome, we should embrace and encourage. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to engage in conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Snead.